today's next session, we have with us Siddharth Guru. He is product lead strategic integrations at Booking.com. Siddharth has extensive experience of 11 plus years. Earlier, he was working as product manager at Flipkart. At Booking.com, he is driving long-term CS capabilities for in-house product and helping the leadership make well-informed build versus buy decisions. As a product manager with strong empathy, Siddharth believes in empowered product teams that build capabilities for the long term while meeting business requirement in the near term. We'll be speaking on the topic working with engineering teams to ship great products at a high velocity. So over to you, Siddharth.
Thank you so much, Priyanka, for the nice introduction, and very happy to meet all of you here. Let me start by sharing screen, and I'd appreciate if someone can just confirm that they can see my screen indeed.
Your screen is visible.
Yeah, we can see it.
Super. Cool. Yes, so I think Priyanka introduced me quite well and way more than how I would introduce myself. What we speak of today is really a big part of what a PM does every day, which is working with engineering. The point is, how do we work effectively with engineering? How do we ship great products and ship them out fast? I like to keep the session interactive. I'll obviously ask you guys a few questions, but I'm also anticipating a few questions coming up. If you have something in mind, please raise your hand, drop a message, or just speak out if you want to ask something. Otherwise, we can always take questions at the end of the session. I'll start with a quick introduction, though I don't think I need a lot because Priyanka has done a great job at that. I started off really in a very different industry. I was working for DRDO, building aircraft engines, helping the country move towards self-reliance. I then did my MBA from IIM Bangalore, where I learned hugely from my peers and my professors. And it was a really changing, it really changed my attitude towards life. Then I started my product career in Flipkart, where I was working on a bunch of products, both around post-sales, post-delivery sort of an experience, and also building a new platform inside Flipkart. And then for the last 2 years, I'm in Booking.com in Amsterdam, helping people explore the world better and safer. Today, we'll talk about a different attitude towards product management, especially for big companies, where you really need to think about capabilities which power your products. We'll talk about the responsibilities between product and engineering and what is the overlap essentially. We'll also talk about how do you help your engineers build very well-designed systems. And then a big part of our work is around execution. So how do you optimize execution for speed and efficiency? And at the end of the day, we'll look at the fact that you cannot do everything on your own. How do you really maximize your personal impact to the product? Let's get started on a few things. Please help me with this question. Is there a question with someone? No. This is a question for the audience. We know Uber, we know Uber Eats. How did Uber launch Uber Eats so quickly? How did Uber Eats become so successful, scaled up so much, and how did it end up becoming a gold mine for Uber in 2020? What helped Uber launch Uber Eats so fast? I can't see your chats, so if you are writing it out, I'll prefer you speak it out.
I think Uber's connectivity to the customers has created a major strong point for them to continuously improve their product. So I think that's the main funda that was happened for them to launch Uber and next to the Uber Eats and so on.
Sure, that's a valid point. What else?
Hi, Gaurav this side. So they have a two-way marketplace already working for Uber. So moving to Uber Eats is almost a replica from driver and customer to restaurant and customers.
Sure. That's a very good observation.
Hello.
Hi. Yeah.
Rishit this side. I think before launching Uber Eats, they have done a good study on the two-wheelers. So two motors were already in the very boom with the Uber, and it will give them a better platform to rebuild and scale with Uber Eats.
Sure. Definitely. So all these three things are really valid. I think the closest and probably the biggest factor is that Uber leveraged whatever it already had built. So there was a way for riders and drivers to connect to each other. It expanded that two-sided marketplace onto a three-sided marketplace. So you have eaters, you have restaurants, and then you have riders who can join this thing. So you take the things that you already have, and they built a completely new product out of it. We'll talk about another example, and this is kind of related. Amazon launching Amazon Prime Pantry. So Amazon e-commerce obviously is a more warehouse-driven product. The products generally have a very long shelf life. You could a TV does not go bad in a year, right? But on the other side, you have Prime Pantry, which is extremely high frequency. People buy from it like 2 to 3 times a week. They are extremely perishable, so you cannot have an egg or maybe a milk packet which is there for more than a few hours. Amazon did the same thing again. It took its core things that it had, which was around listing products, searching for products, discovery, transactions, fulfillment. It pivoted itself into a different area, which is into hyper-local, perishable kind of a gross market, but it really used the same things that it had with it. You can see a pattern emerging here, how companies have evolved to do more with what they already have. I will end this questionnaire with the last example. There is some company in between, which is hidden, obviously, that has one of the highest average daily time spent compared to any other app on Earth right now. Any wild guesses for what is this one platform that can do everything that you see on the platform on the screen? There's a hint. This is a non-Indian product.
Facebook.
Close, but not yet.
Google.
No, Uber does not do photos and
Google
stuff.
then. Google.
Kind of close. Okay, another
Is it
hint, it is
WeChat?
not from US.
Is it WeChat?
Yes.
Is it WeChat, the Chinese
Yes,
app?
it is WeChat. On WeChat, people spend roughly an hour every day on average. Imagine the kind of engagement that this thing drives. It supports more than 1 million apps, but really at the core of it, there are a few key things that it does very, very well. It supports chats, it supports payments, discovery, account management, and so on. But with those key things, it's able to do so much. What you see is a pattern here where companies build core capabilities and leverage these core capabilities to launch new products, new business models over time. Today, we'll talk about this term, the capabilities, in more details, and we'll try to cover some ground around it. Let's talk about what capabilities really mean and the difference between products and capabilities. We all know what products are, right? We use Facebook, we use Instagram, anything, WhatsApp, Google Photos. These are all products. A product is something, a tool that is helping user solve a problem. It is something that drives value to the user, every user, whether it is a real customer, it is an internal user, it's another business, in any way. These products are extremely user facing. They bring revenue to the company, and you really do a lot of iterations on the product so that you can optimize it, make it better, match it with the market, and so on. However, there is something below products which really powers the product. These are called capabilities. These are key things that your business does. Let's take a few examples to clarify this. Let's take example of Flipkart. Flipkart's app, Flipkart's website is a product that you use. The core capability that Flipkart has is about listing products and making them discoverable through a search. It is about fulfilling those products and delivering it to your house. It is about returns and customer support around those products. These are capabilities that eventually power your product. As you can imagine, these capabilities don't change as frequently. You would not say, I don't want search tomorrow. Search will just become better and better every day. So it evolves slowly. Whereas you might see the experience change very drastically from a word, as in a text-based input to a voice-based input. So your product layer can change, but the capabilities are slow in changing. Capabilities are product agnostic, which means I can use the same search to power a grocery search experience. I can use it to do a flight search experience and so on. Then below this capability layer is what we have are the technologies, all the infrastructure that we use, all the databases that is being used, whether you choose a cloud service or an on-premise service, what kind of data layers do you have? All of these bits are really the technology powering the capabilities, which in turn power the products. What it means is that every product that the user interacts with really interacts with the layer of capabilities and then the layer of technologies behind it. And we as PMs have to think about all of this together. This might seem a bit vague, but let's do an exercise and see if we can really understand what capabilities mean. I will take a very generic customer support kind of a product. So users have a problem, they're reaching out to a set of agents on various channels, and let's see how do you build this product. With any product exercise, you always have to be very clear about requirements, and that is where we are right now. Let us say we have the 6 requirements with us. Let's say it is a clear trip, make my trip kind of a product. So we know who the users are. If the users are verified, so we know about them, and they have a flight booking, they should be able to reach a general pool of agents so that they can get their support over call. Let us say there's another requirement that users who are unverified, maybe they don't have an account, but they are logging in through an OTP, and they have a package booking instead of just a flight. They should be able to reach more special agents who can help with flights, with hotels and all of that, again on call. Similarly, a verified users who have an unpaid booking, maybe they just reserved but did not pay or the payment failed. They should be able to reach another set of payment agents on email now, and so on. Then you also have a requirement that every time the user chats with one of our agents, you record the chat, it is logged, and a transcript is sent to the registered email ID. And once the conversation is over, you want a feedback form to be sent. So very simple sort of requirements, a few different types of users, few different types of requirements, meeting few different types of agents, and then you register their contact and you send out a feedback form. Once you've done this exercise very well, when you know this is what your requirements are, the next step is to really find groups of related things. So one thing you can clearly notice that there is a concept of verification of the users. There is a concept of what kind of booking they have. There is a concept of different types of agents. There's a concept of different channels. So if you start grouping this, each of these groups is essentially sort of a capability. You could say that the verification mechanism is a capability. So I need a method by which I can verify the users and figure out if they belong to what category, what kind of user they are they very loyal and stuff like that. There is another capability where I should be able to figure out what bookings does a user have. There's another capability where I can figure out what kind of agents should I redirect them to. So this is how you start looking at patterns in your requirements and seeing what capabilities should exist. Now you can obviously imagine that some things are very complicated here, like routing and figuring out who to send to is complicated. Maybe logging the thing or sending a feedback form is a less complicated capability, but these are capabilities in themselves. Once you've done this, you need to verify that if I want to scale this product tomorrow, if I want to go from flight and package bookings to purely hotel bookings, does this whole setup work or not? So by doing this exercise over and over, you start finding patterns in your requirements, which should be grouped, and you should create capabilities around them. And then each capability can then scale up on their own. This is kind of the starting point towards really building great systems, towards building very scalable architectures for your products. And this is a very different mindset to just building features or optimizing a certain metric. This is really what changes how your product grows. There is the question then comes is, why should we even think about this? Can we not be at the top layer of products, talk about features, about how the experience looks like? Why do we need to go all the way deep so far? I'll refer the 3 layers that we saw earlier. Products are a summation of your capabilities. If your capabilities are bad, if they aren't well designed, your products will never be able to scale. They'll never be able to give you great experiences. Capabilities power rapid experimentation. So you can change the product layer without changing your capabilities. You can change how you do search without changing how the user experiences search, and so on. it helps you scale up. So tomorrow, if you see that your traffic is growing up, you can just change the technology you use, but your product still remains the same. It helps your team build the right system architecture. This is the point we will look at next. And obviously, over time, your teams would be structured around capabilities. So as you become more of a product leader, as you start shaping up your teams build underneath you and around you, you'll see that capabilities really help you figure out what subject matter experts to put in which groups, how a group structured, and so on. Cool. I will pause a bit if people have any questions. Otherwise, we'll move to the next section around system designs.
So one question I have, why don't tech leads focus on building capabilities?
Super nice question. That is essentially my next slide. So I'll not take that question right away.
Okay.
Anything else from anyone? Cool. So getting back to your answer, your question essentially, look at the overall product landscape. On the x-axis, you have on the extreme left, business considerations. So considerations about what kind of business should the company do, what do users want, how do we make more money out of those products, and so on. On the other extreme are the technical considerations. What code base to use? Do you want to use AWS or cloud services, or do you want to host everything in house? What kind of services you want to build? What databases you want to incorporate? So these are two extremes of product thinking essentially. As PMs, we are most accountable for the business considerations part. We are the ones who define what the user wants, what does the business want, and so on. Our accountability gradually reduces towards the infrastructure side, where we are more of consultants there, but not really the drivers of decision. The engineering team's responsibility is the other way around. They are extremely responsible for figuring out what exact code bases to use, what databases to use, and so on. But they are only in a consulting mode when they come to what products to build. Capabilities lie somewhere in between. Capabilities power your products, and the tech powers capabilities. So this is really a place where both the product counterparts and engineering counterparts come together, decide what works best for this product for now and for future. Think of it, let's take an example of a search product, for example. As a product manager, you might want to say that I want users to be able to search for whatever is the, let's say, search on Flipkart. So whatever is the name of the product, user should be able to search with that, just that. The capabilities that a PM would want is matching the intent of what is being typed to what is in the database, making sure that if the user typed in the wrong term, so instead of writing MOBILE for mobile, they typed in MOBLE, we understand that it's more about mobile and not mobile. These are the sort of capabilities you want. So you want intent matching, you want autocorrects, you want some sort of indexation, and so on. The tech folks would say that I would want something like sharding, so I can look at millions of listings. I want some other technology which will help me really search very rapidly, very fluidly. So you bring both these perspectives together into this middle layer, and that is how you start shaping up capabilities together. So it is not just a PM responsibility. It is not just an engineering responsibility. It is really shared.
Understood for that. Thank you. Just one small follow-up on that. So essentially, we are talking here that a search is not a capability, but whatever constitutes the search, which is the matching of the text or the prediction of the correct text, or to be able to click on the button and getting the results, that very part would be a capability.
Yes and no. I'll tell you. So the definition of products and capabilities depends on which level you are looking at the product. So if I were to look at Flipkart overall as a product, I would say search, buy, fulfillment. These are three capabilities that I have. But this is if I was the CEO of Flipkart or the CPO of Flipkart. If I were the leader for search as a product, I would look at indexation, retrieval, intent matching, highlighting, these kind of things as capabilities. If I was the PM for, let's say, indexation as a capability, I would look at, I don't know, maybe sharding or so whatever else. I'm not an expert on that, but I'd look at even more granular pieces as my core capabilities. So it really it is a tree of capabilities, and depending on which node of the tree you are in, you'll have a very different perspective to what you're looking at.
All right, thank you.
Cool. Now let's see how to use this sort of an approach towards building system design. Now, as I mentioned earlier, system design is more of an engineering activity, but we as PMs have a very strong role to play in it. Let's look at a few decisions that engineers make while building systems and while defining system architectures. And let's see how we can use our product hat to influence those decisions. The first thing that an engineer or engineering team decides is whether to use a monolith kind of an architecture or a microservice architecture. Now, these are terms you'll probably hear a lot. Monolith is basically one big code base where everything happens. They're very closely tight and so on, closely built and so on. Obviously, as you can imagine, building one thing is very easy. It's quite quick. It's more easy to understand what's happening, what is not. So it is very, very good for bootstrapping. So you're building a new product. You do not know if it will meet your users' needs. If there's a product market fit, you'd probably go with a monolith. But as your product scales, you would want to independently change pieces of your product without affecting the other. That is where this microservice architecture comes in. So you break down your product into very small components. Each of those components is essentially one service. Microservices are great for agility and scalability. You can do lots of tweakings, lots of experimentation without affecting each other. So it is definitely is great for scale. 99.9% of all good companies, good products today use a microservice architecture. There are a few very limited options where you see a monolith. But the decision for you here is to figure out how much of an effort you want to build a microservice architecture, which is very scalable, versus building something which is trivial but may not scale as well. How critical is it for you to go to market immediately and then decide the approach here? Once you've made this decision along with your engineers, the next thing that comes to mind is how do these services talk to each other? So that introduces the concept of APIs. So APIs are essentially user interfaces for systems. So user can, like you go to Flipkart and you make a query and press a search button, you get a list of listings. Similarly, a computer makes a query to a server, puts in some parameters and gets a response. It's exactly the same. So APIs are essentially an UI for systems. There are two types. There is a polling, there's a pushing kind of mechanism, but this is essentially the next step of things. The third aspect is then about observability. Observability is the fact that you should be able to see what is happening inside the system. So there are 3-4 key things. There's availability, which is how there's a probability that a requested action can be completed. So how available is the system? The latency, which is how much time does a particular action take? Throughput is then how many actions can I do in parallel? So basically, think of it as a train journey. How many trains are available? Can I get a train when I want to have one? That is availability. How long does a train journey take? That is latency. How many trains can run parallelly, or how many people can be on a train? Is it throughput? You'll also hear terms like service level, SLO, SLA, and SLIs. This is a whole topic in itself, but essentially you should also be able to measure how your systems are behaving. And that is where the service level indicators, objectives, and agreements come into play. Our role in all of this, which is very important, first of all, is bringing extreme clarity on the requirements for the short term, near term, and the long term horizons, so that engineers can build great systems. You should be able to understand technology choices and its impact on business. You should be able to drive engineers towards optimal solutions and making the right choices. You will not probably make those, but you'll drive them towards that. And then really prioritizing time spent on decisions. Some of these decisions are really trivial. You can really change the way an API works. You can really change the way something else works. And these are not irreversible decisions. So don't spend too much time on this. Make a decision, move ahead, figure out if your product works or not. Cool. That brings us to the end of the second part. We'll start the next part, which is around managing execution. This is where we'll cover more about sprints and how to maximize your efficiency. I'm sure you would have learned a lot about sprints, but I'll quickly tell you how a sprint typically operates. We as PMs, we create something called product backlog. This is your entire wish list of things that you want your users to be to get, prioritized in terms of impact, criticality, and so on. Now, a product backlog could have thousands of entries. There is absolutely no limit to how much it should have. But obviously, more than a few tens, more than a few hundreds, it becomes really impossible to manage them. Anyway, from the product backlog, you take up the top few key things that you want to do in a sprint. A sprint is usually a 2-week sprint, but depends really on your team. The Scrum team, along with the Scrum team, which is the engineering manager, a set of developers, maybe even designers and so on, you figure out which of these is really achievable within that sprint. And that is what you call the sprint backlog. So out of 100 items in the product backlog, you took up maybe 20 for the planning, and of that 10 were committed for the sprint. The teams then would work on those 10 items for the entire 2 weeks or whatever is it, sprint's duration, meeting every day for 5 or 10 minutes, doing something called the daily scrum, where you talk about how things are progressing. Once the 2-week period is over, you do a sprint review, where you look at what percentage of those tickets were completed. Do they meet the right quality that you expected out of it? Now, with all of that done, is an iteration of your product ready to be shipped. Not every sprint really results in a releasable product, but ideally that is how it should work. After the review, you also do a retrospective where the team talks about what went right or wrong in that entire sprint. The objective here is to figure out avenues for improvement. So you take those improvement areas and then incorporate your planning. This is how, by doing this loop over and over, essentially you become more efficient in driving execution. You become more reliable in the timelines that you commit to. You get a better visibility into how the team is performing and so on. I will then have a question for all of you. When would you call a sprint ideal? Is it if you are releasing products very quickly, very frequently? Would you call the sprint ideal if you are launching codes with 0 bugs? Would you call it ideal if the sprints are shipped on time? Would you call a sprint ideal if everything that you picked up in that sprint is completed? Or would you consider it ideal if your metrics moved very significantly in that sprint? This is a question for the audience, so please feel free to tell me what options you think. What option do you think is the most clear representation of an ideal sprint?
If all the tasks are completed.
Sorry, I didn't get your voice.
If all the tasks are completed and whatever was planned is achieved close to 100%.
Okay, that is a good thing. That is a good target to have for the sprint, but purely from a sprint definition point of view, it is not necessary to complete all the tasks in the sprint.
I'm sorry. So I have a question on similar lines. By the definition, the sprint seem to be having a set of tasks that need to be actually items from the backlog, right? That need to be completed within the time frame. So isn't it about the tasks? The given sprint is one sprint is about the 10 tasks it was taken, right? No.
Yes. Yes.
So success metric has to be like if we are able to complete all the tasks,
Yes, so that is a good way to look at your sprint's efficiency. That did you complete what you did? But that is not really the goal of a sprint, to complete what you took. I'll tell you why this is not a goal. If you start measuring your sprint success based on how many tasks you completed, you are incentivized to break down one task into many subtasks, very trivial subtasks, just to increase the number of tickets you complete. Or you're also incentivizing your engineering team to commit to lesser number of tasks so that they can definitely complete it. That's why you should not have a completion rate as your key metric, because you might unintentionally drive a wrong behavior through that.
Okay, I'm sorry. So that why I gave that pointer was because we talked about sprints. If we talk about the feature success, it would be very different metrics we will track, right?
Sure. Yes, definitely. A feature success is based on the metrics that it was supposed to drive.
Right. So yeah, help us understand like which one.
Sure. Now, this is a more theoretical answer. The answer is, if your increments that you had planned are shipped on time, you know that the sprints are ideal. The objective of this whole exercise of running sprints is to bring in more predictability into your outcome. So you should be able to say that given this list of backlogs, given the scope of the backlog, it will take me X number of sprints to get there. Now, whether you complete all the sprints exactly as planned, or you have 2 of the sprints which were extremely great and 2 which were extremely poor, but you still end up covering, meeting that predicted time, that is what defines the success of a sprint mechanism. Now, this is coming from the agile methodology description. It's slightly difficult to digest, but if you practice this consciously, you'll see that it really makes sense. All the others that we have here, frequent releases, code written with 0 bugs, tasks are completed, metrics move strongly, are definitely good to have. This is definitely your aspiration, but if only one of this is done, you would not say that your sprint is ideal.
Siddharth, one more question on similar lines.
Yeah.
When you say increments are shipped on time, so
Yes.
I want to understand that more. It's like you said it is about bringing the predictability, right?
Yes.
Now,
yes.
can you talk about this with an example?
Okay, let's talk about, let's take 2 products here. Let's say the app experience on Swiggy, where the way you are able to discover restaurants. There's a new feature that the PM for Swiggy wants to introduce, which is you can maybe search by your voice or search by your location, for example, which let's say it never existed. So you can look at restaurants within a 1 kilometer range. Then look at another product, which is, let's say, Windows 12 or Windows 11 is coming up, right? Let's say Windows 11. That is a product in itself.
Right.
Now, Windows 11 takes 3 years to build, but it has to be launched on the day that it was promised, because there's a whole audience around it. The nearby product on Swiggy probably takes 2 sprints to build. If you delay it by a week or by another sprint, it really does not make a lot of difference. There is a loss of business, obviously. There's a reduction in the metric you could have moved, but it will not affect the business very strongly. Now, iterations on Swiggy, for example, can happen very frequently. You will release features every 2-3 sprints. Iterations on a Windows product happens once every month or maybe once every quarter. So different products have different life cycles with which they release iterations. Hence, it is good for us to measure the predictability of those interactions, of those iterations, not on the number of those iterations.
Can you repeat the last line? Predictability of the...
So any number of iterations that you might have within a time frame, it is good to be very predictable around when you would release that iteration, rather than counting the number of iterations you released.
Okay.
So I might say I'll release 1 iteration every year, or I might say I'll release 12 iterations every year. But if you're able to predict that exactly on the 31st of the month, you are able to ship an iteration, that is successful. Or if I'm able to say that on December 31st every year, I'll ship 1 iteration only, even then you are successful. It just depends on the product context.
Okay. What I understand is that you're saying maybe if we are able to follow the roadmap.
Yes, kind of, yes.
Okay. Sure.
The roadmap is also a big discussion point. Roadmaps are supposed to be very accurate for the next quarter or so, but the further down you look ahead in the roadmap, the more fuzzy it becomes. But that's a good way of looking at it. If your sprints are able to align to what the roadmap was, then you know that your roadmap was well thought through and that your sprints are being executed very well.
Sure.
Cool. Any more questions on this? If not, let's move ahead. We were talking about predictability right now. Let's talk about what reduces predictability. Now, there are many reasons. I have listed the top 5 that come to my mind. One and the biggest thing that I've observed is around lack of clear requirements. So we start off with a backlog item, which is kind of fuzzy. In this example, we could say, introduce nearby search on Swiggy. Now that absolutely has 0 meaning as a requirement. You need to have very clear description of what that requirement means, that I want users with location on to search within exactly a 1 kilometer distance, radius, and so on. If you don't do this well, your dev team, your designers will spend a lot of time discussing these clarifications, making course corrections. They'll build something that you didn't want, and so on. So you'll just waste time around it. The second part is around improper planning. This is a joint effort again. Probably you did not anticipate how complex a thing is. Probably the dependencies were not known, and so on. The third thing which often occurs is around concurrent design, development, and testing. So within the same sprint, you took up a design task. You also took up the development of that design piece and then test it out. So if one thing is delayed or one thing is slow, everything else is affected. The fourth thing is around unplanned dependencies. This is not really a lot you can control, but you should be aware of what any feature might, the dependencies of a feature on other things. And that is where you should be aware of it. For example, the nearby location, you should know that Swiggy would require a location access. So you need to work with the app core team to figure out how to get location access for your users. And then the last point is around unexpected task complexity. Some things are way more difficult than you might have predicted, and that is completely natural. As your systems become more and more complex, the complexity really increases over time. It's a vicious cycle, essentially. There are many more reasons, but I think these are the top few things. Let's look at how we can reduce this kind of predictability, how we improve this kind of predictability. First step, clear requirements. This was very clearly talked about in the previous session as well. As a PM, you need to be very clear about the vision and goals, not just for the product itself, but also for that specific sprint. What do you want to achieve at the end of the sprint? Clear user stories. A typical pattern I follow is, as a user, I want to do this so that I can achieve this. If it is very clear and very granular, you know that the developers are working on exactly the things that really matter to the users. Third is having a set of acceptance criteria. Now, this is kind of similar to user stories, but a little more detailed. So it would say that if I, as a user, search for a property for a restaurant in this time, I should find this. If there are no restaurants found, I should return a screen which says nothing found, something like that, much more granular. And this is more for the testing team to really test out real use cases and see if the product works well. Third, have a bunch of wireframes or designs, whichever works best. Do not skip the edge cases. Typically, the most time is spent around corner cases, edge cases. Talk about how the things work, interact, and so on. The next way to improve velocity is through sequencing activities. So ideally, for everything that the dev is working on in that sprint, everything should be ready before that. Imagine a situation where you have a designer with you, and then you have a set of developers, and you are designing something on the app. So in sprint 1, you are really looking for what you want to deliver in the third sprint, which is 2 sprints ahead. Hopefully, you will complete your product research, your requirements in sprint 1, so that for the same bit, the designers can start designing for the next sprint in the current sprint. So in sprint 2, the designer is really working on product increment 3. And then the developer can work on product increment 3 in sprint 3. So you need to be at least 2 to 3 sprints ahead of what the designers and developers are working on. So by sequencing them well and enough in time, you can really make sure that there are no blockages, there are no bottlenecks through the whole process. Cool. This is a lot to assimilate in one session. I just end the session with one set of thoughts around how do you maximize your own impact. You cannot really do everything about the product. You cannot focus on the requirements and the development and system design, all of it. US PMs are hired specifically for product discovery and also for execution. So spend a lot of time in product sense, product design, product market fit, understanding your users, all of that. Focus very clearly on the why and what of your product. Know the how of it, but don't get lost in it. Leave that to the designers, leave that to the developers to figure out. Trust the team. Thirdly, don't get too much involved in project management. We as PMs will always have to do project management, but don't get too engrossed in it. Don't make that the biggest chunk of your work. Do a lot of data analysis, be very clear about the numbers, but don't get stuck in that paralysis of getting numbers and making sure you're taking every decision correctly. The last bit is around trivial decisions. Take things which can be really reversed very quickly. Don't spend too much time on it. Focus more on the strategic bets. And then use a lot of communication. I cannot stress this enough. frequent and comprehensive communication is the best way to keep everyone on the same page within your team and outside your team. If you do this, you'll end up spending a lot more time on the product work and not less time on the project management or anybody else's work. And that way you can really drive more impact to the product overall, to yourself, to your own career, and to the company overall. I will end the session here and I'll open up the forum for thoughts and questions around the thing.
Hi, Siddharth.
Thanks, Siddharth.
Can I go?
Okay, thanks, Siddharth. This was a really good session. But it just got me thinking about, the different types of personas that we have in any organization, that is product owner, product manager, and business analyst, and of course the scrum masters as well. So like out of these four, or essentially the three, product manager, product owner, and business analyst, how would you differentiate in terms of the primary areas of focus each one should have?
Sure, that's a good question. First of all, the term product owner is kind of going away from the market. We have product managers mostly. Earlier, when there was when these two roles really existed as two independent ones, a product owner was more focused on execution. So he or she would take the product backlog and then make sure that it is executed at the highest efficiency. The product owner did not have a lot of say around what is built, why we're building something, how to move the matrices. The other side of that was product managers, but they would really look at what the customers want, where there is more revenue to be made, what kind of things are to be built, and so on. And they look very little at the execution. Given that these two roles are no longer very disjoint, you would have PMs looking at both the sense as well as execution parts of product. Depending on where you are in the product career, if you're just starting off, you might be more involved in the execution. If you become a senior PM, maybe a group PM, you'll spend a lot more time on the product execution and stakeholder management, product sense and stakeholder management than on the execution. The third role you mentioned was around business analyst. I think they are a very strong, sort of a right hand to the PM. They give you all the right matrices, all the right insights into how your consumers are behaving or what they want. They are kind of close to the product manager's shoes, just that they're very far away from the execution. So they're all the data guy, the metrics guy, the why sort of guys. Does this answer your question?
Yes, it kind of does. Actually, in my organization, I'm playing the role of business analyst as well as product owner. So all the things that you mentioned is what I've been doing, but yes, very less of, thinking from the user perspective and more of execution is what that is.
Yeah, so I can anticipate that as a product owner, you are doing a lot of execution, but as a business analyst, you should be able to have a lot of the customer thinking, maybe not directly speaking to the customers yet, but at least in terms of how they behave on your platform, getting those insights. You're already doing a lot of things.
Yes, analytics. Yes, definitely.
Yes.
Thank you.
Siddharth?
Hey then.
Hey, Siddharth, I like this analogy of the capability, that the 3-deck way of looking at it. So one of the challenges I faced is I'm not in a product company, but in a services company, working as a product manager for a retailer. And so in our company, we have to keep on hopping between kind of domains and industries. So of course, the technology also changed, right? So one of the challenges was this, the capability part, right? We know what happens with the customer, the empathy and all this part, but the underlying capability is basically you need to be very close to a platform. And at times I felt like, as a not so very hardcore tech guy, I found it very tough to kind of get to the meat of what are the capabilities. So any sort of any experiences from you where you were able to kind of crack open that? Because sometimes you just can't just go and bug the tech team also to know what are the capabilities that we can drive. So and any sort of insights into how we can also kind of get kind of comfortable in that.
Sure. So I think this largely comes from practice and also from reading a lot of how things have operated. So I'll advise you on a lot of, so you should look at engineering blogs from the big companies, from all the FANG companies. They talk a lot about how they're building these core capabilities inside the company. But beyond that, when you look at any product problem, the product problem is the why of what you're doing, right? That is very clear. Look at what all do you aim your product to be able to do, what all you aim your users to be able to do. Those whats are essentially capabilities. You mentioned about the retail industry. In any retail industry, there are a few key whats. One what is listing, one what is pricing, good pricing, one what is fulfillment, inventory management, and so on. So these are essentially the key capabilities that you would have in any retail business, whether it is e-retail or brick and mortar retail. Now, how it is implemented, which is the how part, is when it comes to technology and platform and code and all of that. You really don't need to bother a lot about it, but think about commonalities between the whats across various industries. I'm kind of giving you a very vague answer, but this is really it comes more by experiencing it and trying out few things. Maybe if you want, we can take a quick example and see how you would break it down into a capability. Do you want to do maybe, let's say, WhatsApp as a product and see how to break it down into capabilities?
Yeah, sure. Maybe we can take a retailer only, right? So something like listing, like search is one of the things, right? And on the other side, there's fulfillment, which is the what I understand is, so where I find it tough was, like, we know there's a order management system, which is actually the backbone of that, right?
Yes, so, but that is not a capability. Order management system is a system. It is part of the tech layer. What you are talking about as a capability is order management. That is a capability.
So I've been able to, like, usually I look at the journey and then I try to look at the smaller use cases behind that.
Yes.
So now question I always ask is, like, is this something the OMS can try to, can be fulfilled through the OMS? So that kind of questions, that's where I kind of get stuck, and then I'm dependent on some of my colleagues. The capabilities, I understand that, like you rightly put for Flipkart, right? Search, listing, ease of findability, right? Those things, and intent, all those things. I'm just thinking in terms of, sometimes I feel like, when you're in a engineering-led company or product, but engineering is equally as valued in the company, right? So sometimes as product managers, a little bit of lack of knowledge will put you in a back foot. So that's what I was trying to see. Is there anything that we should do differently to be at least more effective?
Yeah, for sure. No, so in most of the product and engineering companies, both product and engineering have an equal role to play in this process.
Exactly.
So when you talk about OMS and you want to see if a new use case fits into the OMS, what you can think about as a product manager is whether the user action or the system action is closely related to what the OMS already does, like order management as a capability, whatever it does. Is this new use case related to it, or it is not related? And you should be very clear about why you think it is related or not. Let us say you want to you want to persist the user's purchase history for 10 years, and let's say it just vanished today after an order is fulfilled, and you want to persist it. You can already see that it is very closely related to the order management. If you take something else, it might be very distant away. So in your mind, be clear about why you think this fits into that capability or why it does not. Have that rationale, and then use that rationale to drive conversations with your engineering. Your engineering might say that, no, these are technically very different things, so they don't fit together. Then it's then it's not the same capability. You do not have to be right all the time, but you just need to have a rationale to begin with.
Sure. Okay, maybe I'm just sometimes I think, like you said, just bogged down with the how part a little bit. Probably. I need to get out of that probably.
Yes, exactly. I did the same mistake in my initial days. I was too deep into the how that I forgot to look at the why and the whats, and that is what I was really hired for. I was not hired for the how. I was hired for the why and what.
Sure. Thanks, Siddharth. Yeah. Thanks.
Siddharth, this is Atul here.
Oh,
I have a question on that sequencing part, right? So how it is different from traditional waterfall approach, right? We are just rewording the things that we are doing some sort of thing in a particular sprint, but if we look it holistically, it looks like old beautiful way of doing design, analysis, testing in different phases. So I'm just wondering how it fits into sprint kind of thing.
Sure. Now that's a very fair observation. I'll tell you the difference between traditional waterfall and this sort of agile. In traditional waterfall, what you would have done is spent, let's say, a few months only designing, then a few months only developing, and then a few months only testing, right? And that is where at the end of the day, you know that what you built after 9 months is not really what you wanted 9 months ahead. Over here, you're looking at a much smaller time horizon. You are looking at one sprint of design, one sprint of development, one sprint of testing, maybe half a sprint of testing. So you have really condensed that 9 months time period into a 1 month sort of a time period. Your requirements are far less likely to change at such high in such a small time frame. You still have all the flexibility to go around. Because you're spending only 2 weeks on a design, you are not looking at a very big change at any point of time. You're looking at a small change, which you can test and figure out at the end of 2 sprints. So it is not really that waterfall. It is somewhere in between. It helps you unblock dependencies, but it still gives you that agility that you were missing with the waterfall approach. And in my drawing, I very clearly separated requirements, design, and development, making it look like 3 sprints. But in reality, you'll probably have this at much smaller bits. So one of your tasks will not run for an entire sprint. So one task should not take 2 weeks of one developer, which means the design for that task also will not take 2 weeks for one designer. And it should not take you 2 weeks to write just one task. So the timelines are really are much smaller than what I showed in the drawing. The drawing was more to drive the concept of sequencing.
Right, but still it's a phased gate approach, right?
Yeah.
Though it's a 2 week or 1 week, but still it's a phased gate approach. So yes. I mean, on top of it, why can't we do let's say dual track agility kind of thing, like what Marty Kagan, other folks suggest, JIP pattern, right? Yeah. You have a discovery track with PM and group of PMs, let's say team of PMs doing that, and then your delivery team executing those things which you are feeding forward to them.
Yeah, that is also an approach that some companies follow, where you have a discovery track and you have an execution track, and sometimes the resources are shared across both. So you need a PM in both of these, you need a developer in both of these. Maybe the design is only in discovery. That is a good approach to begin with, but there are a lot of publications around the fact that you are no longer able to predict how much time does discovery take, how much time does execution take within a sprint. You might spend a lot of time debating on the design, leaving very little time for development, or vice versa. So if you don't time box it, it becomes a little messy. But there is no published literature which says that one of them is better than the other. They are both good in their own format, and you need to figure out what works best for you as a team.
Makes sense. Thank you.
The other thing to consider there, Atulya, is that there might be other teams which are not as flexible. For example, let's say operations or legal, they are not as agile as you want to as your designers or developers. So if you have to take a legal clearance for something, you need to plan for it way ahead, and hence the sequencing might also be influenced by such kind of considerations.
Absolutely. I mean, working in financial institute, I can totally relate with that.
Yes. Yeah. Super. Any further questions? Otherwise, I'll request Priyanka to take over.
Hi, Siddharth. I have a quick question. The question is on the line of sprints and backlog the tasks, right? Each item is basically a requirement which needs to be defined clearly as probably a PRD, right?
Yes.
Now, but one PRD may be huge also. It can contain a lot of details, right? Now, the question is around how do we divide the PRD into tasks?
Sure. That is a very, very good question. So if you're building a new product, your PRD definitely runs into pages. One easy way of doing this is in your PRD, don't structure your PRD in terms of user stories, first of all. So instead of saying that so there are two ways people write PRD, actually many ways, but two of the ways that I've seen are most common. One is around capabilities of systems. So here are the requirements for order management. Here are the requirements for search. Here are the requirements for fulfillment, for example. The other angle to it is writing user stories. So as a user, I want to do this and get this. I prefer the second one because each of those user stories typically is a task for the backlog. And it also makes your thought process very, very clear. The developer could just pick up one of the user stories, look at everything that's inside the user story, and then execute on it. So if you do it well, one user story should relate to one ticket for one sprint, but sometimes it's not that straightforward. It could be one or more tickets, one or more subtasks, or spread over a few sprints.
Sorry, so each user story can be a PRD.
So a PRD has a lot of user stories. Each user story is a task in the backlog.
Okay. So the PRD should basically be divided into user stories, and that will be each task probably on the.
Yes.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, I have another question on the lines of the software development lifecycle. When we do the PRD writing, then planning, prioritizing, sprint execution, and later phases of this, right? How do we judge the quality? I mean, sorry, not quality, success of each stage?
Can you repeat the question? I'm just trying to understand the question better.
Sorry. So there are multiple stages of software development lifecycle, right? Now, how do we judge the success or failure of each stage? So it's like PRD. You thought about the particular sprint execution, right? In very deep depth. Now I'm talking about the phases before that and after that.
Sure. Okay. I'll reverse the question back to you. How would you say that a PRD that you have written is good or has met its requirements, the requirements of the PRD essentially?
Okay, this is difficult.
No, it's kind of straightforward. Think about it. Why did you write a PRD at all?
To explain my requirement to the stakeholders.
Exactly. So if your stakeholders are aligned on the PRD, if it is not approved but agreed upon by everyone that is impacted by that PRD, you know that PRD has been successful.
Right. Okay.
That is one step. So you evangelize your PRD, give deadlines for your stakeholders to read and comment on it, so that there has to be pressure on them to review it, right? Take your PRDs to your key stakeholders, maybe your product peers, your manager, your engineering lead, your designers, and so on. If everyone is happy, you know that the PRD is successful. The second thing around execution that we talked about, that the measure for success of a sprint is predictability. So if you are able to predict how much you can cover in a sprint and you are able to really achieve that predicted quantity or quality, then you know that you've made the execution pretty well. Overall, if you look at how you are doing this to move some metric for your product, right? You are trying to deliver some sort of value to your users, that you can measure through metrics over time. If sprint on sprint, your numbers are moving up or going down in whichever direction they were supposed to go, you know that your product overall and all of these bits have achieved success.
Sure.